4 men who had consumed 3 cans of lager each completed a hostage extraction in Basra that 14 sober American operators had failed to achieve across 2 separate attempts spanning 11 days. The cost of the British operation was £8,400. The combined cost of the American failures exceeded $2.3 million. These numbers appeared on Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Pruitt's desk in Baghdad on the morning of September 14, 2006, and he could not reconcile them with anything he had been taught about operational readiness. Pruitt had served 19 years in United States Army Special Operations. He had completed Ranger School, the Special Forces Qualification Course, and 2 rotations commanding Delta Force assault squadrons. His understanding of combat effectiveness was built on a foundation of physiological optimization, strict pre-mission protocols, and the absolute prohibition of alcohol within 72 hours of any operation. The British SAS team that had just extracted 3 Western contractors from an insurgent safehouse had been drinking Heineken 6 hours before departure. The after-action report noted this without apparent concern. The disparity between American and British approaches to operator management was not merely philosophical. American Special Operations units deployed with nutritionists, sports psychologists, and sleep optimization specialists. The equipment budget for a single Delta Force operator exceeded $22,000 annually, not including weapons systems. British SAS operators received a kit allowance of approximately £1,800 per year and were expected to modify standard-issue equipment themselves. The Americans had access to real-time satellite imagery, dedicated drone coverage, and signals intelligence teams embedded at forward operating bases. The British worked from printed photographs and relied on human sources developed over months of patient cultivation. What Pruitt witnessed over the following 18 months would fundamentally alter his understanding of what makes special operations forces effective. But the explanation would not come from official channels. The cultural clash had been building since the earliest days of the Iraq insurgency. American Special Operations doctrine emphasized what planners called kinetic optimization, the precise application of overwhelming force at decisive moments. Every element of operator preparation was designed to maximize physical performance during the critical minutes of direct action. Sleep schedules were monitored, nutrition was calibrated, hydration levels were tracked through mandatory urine tests. The consumption of alcohol was viewed as a degradation of the human weapons system, a self-inflicted impairment that no professional would tolerate. British SAS culture operated on entirely different assumptions. The regiment's history stretched back to the North African desert campaigns of 1941, where small groups of men conducted raids behind enemy lines with minimal support and maximal autonomy. Survival depended not on institutional support, but on individual judgment, adaptability, and the kind of unit cohesion that could only be built through shared hardship and shared celebration. Alcohol was not viewed as a performance inhibitor, but as a social lubricant essential to the maintenance of trust between men who might be asked to die for each other within hours. Pruitt's first direct exposure to this cultural difference occurred during the joint planning session at the British compound in Basra. He had arrived expecting a formal briefing with PowerPoint presentations and detailed operational graphics. What he found instead was a group of bearded men in civilian clothing gathered around a folding table covered with hand-drawn maps satellite photographs printed on ordinary paper, and several opened bottles of warm beer. The mission they were planning would launch in 14 hours. By American standards, this was operational negligence. The American officer's initial assessment was documented in a memorandum he sent to his commanding officer that evening. The British approach was characterized as unprofessional, their planning process as inadequate, and their physical readiness as questionable. He recommended that American units decline participation in joint operations until the British demonstrated compliance with basic pre-mission protocols. The memorandum was acknowledged, but no action was taken. Pruitt would later understand why. But the true test was approaching faster than anyone anticipated. The target was a mid-level insurgent commander responsible for coordinating improvised explosive device attacks against coalition convoys in southern Iraq. American intelligence had been tracking him for 4 months. 2 previous attempts to capture him had failed. The first compromised by an information leak, the second aborted when the target moved locations hours before the assault. The American approach had involved extensive surveillance, detailed planning, and assault forces of between 12 and 16 operators supported by helicopter gunships, medical evacuation teams, and quick reaction forces. The British were given the mission after the second American failure. Their planning cycle was 46 hours. Their assault force was 4 men. Their support consisted of a single vehicle for extraction and a radio frequency monitored by a watch officer 12 kilometers away. When Pruitt learned the details, he formally objected to the operation proceeding under British command. His objections were noted in the operational log, but overruled by the Joint Task Force commander. The operation would proceed as planned. What Pruitt did not understand, what he could not understand without witnessing it himself, was that the apparent casualness of British preparation concealed a fundamentally different operational philosophy. American doctrine sought to eliminate uncertainty through planning, technology, and overwhelming force. British doctrine accepted uncertainty as inevitable and trained operators to function effectively within it. The difference was not in what they knew, but in what they could tolerate not knowing. The 4 British operators departed their compound at 0100 hours on the night of the operation. Pruitt had access to their communications through the Joint Operations Center. He expected to hear the constant radio traffic that characterized American assaults, situation reports, position updates, requests for information. Instead, there was silence. The British team transmitted exactly 3 times during the entire operation, once to confirm departure, once to report success, and once to request extraction. The assault lasted 11 minutes from entry to extraction. 3 Western contractors were recovered alive. 4 insurgents were neutralized. The target was captured without injury. Total ammunition expended, 17 rounds. The American operations against the same target had fired over 400 rounds without achieving any objective. That detail, 17 rounds versus 400, would stay with Pruitt for years afterward. When the British team returned to their compound, Pruitt was waiting. He wanted to understand how 4 men had accomplished what his own forces had repeatedly failed to achieve. The operators were unwinding in their common area, still wearing the clothes they had assaulted in, still carrying the smell of cordite and adrenaline. Someone had opened the cooler of beer. They offered Pruitt one. He declined. The team leader was a sergeant with 17 years in the regiment. His explanation of the operation was casual, almost dismissive. They had developed a source inside the target's network over the previous 3 months. The source had provided the precise location and the number of guards. The assault plan was simple because the intelligence was good. The intelligence was good because they had invested time in relationships rather than technology. Pruitt asked about the pre-mission drinking. The sergeant's response would eventually find its way into a classified study on special operations effectiveness conducted by the Rand Corporation in 2009. The sergeant said that a man who cannot function after 3 beers has no business conducting operations where everything will go wrong anyway. The American officer did not know how to interpret this statement. It violated every principle of his training, yet the results were undeniable. Over the following months, Pruitt began systematically documenting the differences between American and British approaches. His initial skepticism gradually transformed into something closer to professional curiosity. The data he collected would eventually form the basis of a report that circulated through Special Operations Command with the informal title, The Alcohol Paradox, a document that was never officially acknowledged but was widely read. The British SAS selection process, Pruitt discovered, was designed to produce a fundamentally different type of operator than American programs. The physical standards were comparable. What differed was the emphasis on psychological resilience and autonomous judgment. The American model sought to create specialists who could execute complex tasks under optimal conditions. The British model sought to create generalists who could improvise solutions under the worst possible conditions. This philosophical difference manifested in every aspect of their respective cultures. American operators lived on bases with extensive recreational facilities, nutritional support, and mental health resources. British operators lived in shared houses in provincial cities, bought their own groceries, and maintained cover identities that required them to function as ordinary civilians between operations. The American model protected operators from the chaos of normal life. The British model immersed them in it. The selection course itself reflected these different priorities. American Special Operations selection emphasized performance metrics. How fast could a candidate run? How much could he carry? How accurately could he shoot? British SAS selection emphasized something harder to measure. How did a candidate behave when exhausted, lost, hungry, and uncertain whether the exercise would ever end? Candidates for SAS selection endured what the regiment called the hills, 4 weeks of increasingly brutal marches across the Brecon beacons in Wales, carrying Bergen rucksacks that grew heavier as the weeks progressed. The pass rate fluctuated between 8 and 15%, but physical failure was not the primary cause of elimination. Most candidates were removed through what instructors called voluntary withdrawal, the moment when a man decided he could no longer continue. The regiment had discovered, over decades of operational experience, that this moment of voluntary withdrawal was the single most important data point in predicting future performance. A man who quit when exhausted would quit when the operation went wrong. A man who continued despite exhaustion would find solutions when solutions seemed impossible. The drinking culture existed because it tested something similar: the ability to function when conditions were suboptimal, when the mind was not clear, when the body was not at its peak. Pruitt began to understand this logic only when he witnessed its application in combat. The third night of the operation brought what Pruitt would later describe as the defining moment of his career. The British patrol had established an observation position overlooking a compound that American intelligence believed housed a mid-level Taliban commander. Satellite imagery showed movement patterns consistent with a high-value target. Signals intelligence suggested communications equipment operating from the location. Everything pointed toward a significant capture opportunity. The American plan called for an air assault using 2 MH-60 Black Hawks, a ground quick reaction force of 42 operators, and continuous overhead surveillance from an AC-130 gunship. The estimated cost of the operation exceeded $1.7 million. The British sergeant commanding the 4-man SAS patrol suggested an alternative approach that made Pruitt question whether the man was serious. What happened in the next 18 hours would fundamentally alter Pruitt's understanding of special operations. The British plan involved walking, not infiltrating by helicopter, not approaching under covering fire, not establishing a perimeter with overwhelming force. Walking. 4 men would approach the compound on foot, using terrain features to mask their movement, timing their approach to coincide with the target's established sleep patterns. They would enter through a section of wall that satellite imagery showed as damaged, neutralize the target, and extract on foot to a pickup point 7 kilometers distant. Pruitt's objections filled 3 pages of notes. The approach offered no fire support. The extraction route crossed open ground. The team carried no heavy weapons. The communication plan relied on a single frequency with no redundancy. Every element of the plan violated principles he had spent his career learning. He submitted his concerns through the proper channels and received acknowledgement that his assessment had been noted. The British patrol departed at 2200 hours. Pruitt monitored their progress from the Joint Operations Center, watching their position markers move across the digital map at a pace that seemed impossibly slow. American operations moved at helicopter speed. Insert, execute, extract. This felt like watching paint dry through a satellite feed. At 0130, the patrol reported reaching their final observation position. They would wait for another 90 minutes before beginning their approach. Pruitt calculated that an American team would have already completed the mission and returned to base in the time these 4 men spent watching. The assault began at 0312. Pruitt expected to hear gunfire, explosions, the controlled chaos of close-quarters combat. Instead, the radio remained silent. Minutes passed. The position markers showed the patrol inside the compound. Still no transmissions. At 0327, a single code word crackled through the speakers. Jackpot. The target had been secured without a single shot fired. But this was only the beginning of what Pruitt would witness that night. The extraction route that Pruitt had flagged as dangerously exposed proved to be anything but. The British sergeant had identified ground that satellite imagery showed as flat, but that actual terrain analysis revealed as corrugated with shallow wadis, dried stream beds invisible from above, but deep enough to conceal moving figures. The patrol moved through these natural trenches like water flowing downhill, their pace increasing now that the mission's critical phase was complete. At 0415, the situation changed. A vehicle appeared on a road that intersected the extraction route. Headlights swept across the open ground between 2 wadis. The patrol froze. Pruitt watched their position markers stop moving and felt his stomach tighten. 4 men, 1 prisoner, 7 kilometers from extraction, and a vehicle full of unknown occupants less than 200 meters away. The vehicle stopped. Doors opened. Pruitt counted 6 figures emerging on the thermal feed. They were armed. They began walking toward the wadi, where the patrol lay motionless. What Pruitt witnessed over the next 34 minutes redefined his understanding of what human beings could endure. The British patrol did not move, not a centimeter. The approaching figures walked to within 11 meters of their position, stopped, and began what appeared to be a routine security check. Cigarettes were lit. Conversation drifted across the cold desert air. One of the armed men walked to the edge of the wadi and urinated into it, his stream landing less than 3 meters from where a British operator lay pressed into the sand. Pruitt later learned that the patrol sergeant had made a calculated decision in those first seconds. Fight meant 6 dead Afghans, a compromised mission, and a prisoner who might be killed in the crossfire. Wait meant trusting that 6 armed men would not notice 4 operators and a bound prisoner lying in shadow less than 15 meters away. The patrol waited. They controlled their breathing. They did not shift position when muscles cramped or when the cold seeped through their clothing. The prisoner, secured and gagged, was held motionless by one operator whose grip never wavered despite the strain. The armed men finished their cigarettes and returned to their vehicle. At 04:49, they drove away. The patrol remained motionless for another 12 minutes before the sergeant transmitted a single word. Continuing. Pruitt's hands were shaking. He had witnessed American operators perform extraordinary feats under fire, charging into ambushes, extracting wounded under impossible conditions, fighting with a courage that defied description. But he had never seen anything like what he had just observed. 4 men had survived not through aggression, but through absolute stillness, not through firepower, but through patience, not through technology, but through the fundamental human capacity to endure discomfort without flinching. The detail about controlled breathing that Pruitt had dismissed during his observation of British training suddenly became comprehensible. These men had spent years learning to regulate their physiological responses under stress. Their heart rates had not spiked when armed men approached. Their breathing had not quickened. Their bodies had not betrayed them through involuntary movement. And this, Pruitt began to understand, connected directly to the drinking culture he had found so baffling. A man who could function effectively after consuming significant quantities of alcohol had learned to separate physical discomfort from mental clarity. The headache, the nausea, the sluggishness. These became background noise to be managed rather than obstacles to be overcome. The same skill translated directly to combat situations where pain, fear, and exhaustion threatened to overwhelm rational thought. The extraction continued without further incident. At 06:22, the patrol reached their pickup point. A single vehicle collected them and their prisoner. By 0700, they were back at the forward operating base, the target secured, intelligence materials recovered, and not a single round expended. Pruitt met them as they returned. 4 men climbed out of the vehicle, looking exactly as they had when they departed. No visible excitement, no celebration, no indication that they had just accomplished what American planners considered a high-risk mission. The sergeant handed over the prisoner with the same casual efficiency he might use when returning borrowed equipment. Then something happened that crystallized everything Pruitt had been struggling to understand. The British sergeant walked to a cooler that sat outside their accommodation block. He retrieved 4 cans of beer, warm, because refrigeration was scarce, and the British didn't seem to care about temperature. He handed one to each member of his patrol. They opened the cans, drank, and said almost nothing to each other. Pruitt approached. He paused, searching for words. That was the most impressive display of discipline I've ever witnessed. The sergeant looked at him with an expression that suggested mild confusion. That was Tuesday, he said. Fancy a drink? Pruitt accepted the offered beer. It was warm, cheap, and tasted like victory. He drank it, standing next to 4 men who smelled of sweat, sand, and a particular staleness that comes from lying motionless in a desert wadi for 34 minutes, while armed men stood meters away. The taste of that single warm beer would stay with Pruitt for the rest of his career. In the weeks that followed, Pruitt began compiling data that challenged everything he thought he knew about operational effectiveness. The British patrol he had accompanied completed 17 missions during his attachment. All 17 achieved their objectives. Total ammunition expended across all operations, 47 rounds. Total casualties, 0. Total prisoners captured, 23. Total cost of operations, approximately £84,000, including transportation, equipment maintenance, and consumables. American operations during the same period showed different patterns. The unit Pruitt had previously served with completed 22 missions. 14 achieved their primary objectives. Ammunition expenditure exceeded 40,000 rounds. Casualties included 3 killed and 11 wounded. The cost of operations approached $19 million. Pruitt understood that direct comparison was methodologically problematic. Mission types differed. Operating environments varied. Command structures allocated tasks based on capability assessments that favored different approaches for different situations. The numbers alone proved nothing, but the numbers suggested something that pure analysis could not capture. He began tracking the metric that American command did not officially recognize, what the British called the compromise rate. This measured how often operations were detected by enemy forces before achieving their objectives. American helicopter-borne assaults showed a compromise rate of approximately 31%. Nearly 1 in 3 missions encountered prepared resistance because the enemy heard or saw the approach. British foot mobile operations showed a compromise rate of less than 4%. The difference in outcomes traced directly to this single variable. Missions that achieved surprise succeeded at rates exceeding 80%. Missions where the enemy was prepared succeeded at rates below 40%. The British approach, for all its apparent primitiveness, maximized surprise through minimal signature. The American approach, for all its technological sophistication, often announced its arrival before operators reached their targets. And threaded through all of this was the alcohol culture that had initially seemed so contradictory. Pruitt interviewed several British operators about their drinking habits, approaching the subject with the careful neutrality of a researcher rather than the judgment of a critic. The responses followed a consistent pattern that revealed a philosophy rather than mere indulgence. One operator, a corporal with 9 years of service, explained it in terms that finally made sense to Pruitt's American mind. The regiment asks us to do things that reasonable people wouldn't attempt, he said. We spend weeks living in holes, eating cold food, pissing in bags, watching targets through scopes until our eyes blur. When that's over, we want to feel human again. A few pints with the lads, reminds us that there's life outside the job. It's not escape, it's balance. Another operator, older and more senior, offered a different perspective. Americans train like athletes. Everything optimized, everything measured, everything controlled. We train like humans. We accept that sometimes you'll be tired, sometimes you'll be hurting, sometimes you'll have made stupid decisions the night before. The job still needs doing. Learning to perform when you're not at your best, that's the skill that matters when everything goes wrong. This philosophy permeated every aspect of British special operations culture, in ways Pruitt was only beginning to comprehend. The statistics that crossed Pruitt's desk 3 weeks after the operation's conclusion told a story that no amount of cultural prejudice could dismiss. During the 14-month deployment period that included the Ramadi operations, American Special Operations teams in Anbar Province conducted 217 direct action missions. Of these, 94 resulted in positive target acquisition, a jackpot rate of 43.3%. The compromise rate, missions where the assault element was detected before reaching the objective, stood at 31%. Average mission cost, including helicopter support, ISR assets, and equipment expenditure, came to $412,000. The British SAS squadron, operating in the same battlespace during the same period, conducted 61 missions. 47 resulted in positive target acquisition, a jackpot rate of 77.1%. The compromise rate was 8%. Average mission cost came to £23,000, roughly $31,000 at contemporary exchange rates. Pruitt stared at these numbers for a long time. The differential wasn't marginal. It wasn't within statistical noise. British operators were achieving nearly double the success rate at less than 1/10 the cost, with a compromise rate that was nearly 4 times lower. But the figure that truly arrested his attention appeared in a supplementary analysis prepared by a defense contractor studying force effectiveness metrics. The report examined what it termed operator readiness degradation factors, anything that might compromise mission performance. Among American SOF units, alcohol consumption within 48 hours of an operation was flagged as a potential issue in 0.7% of after-action reviews. Among British SAS operations, alcohol consumption within 12 hours of deployment was noted in 38% of mission logs, not as a concern, but simply as an observed fact. The report's authors had included this data point as an anomaly requiring further study. They couldn't explain how a force with significantly higher pre-mission alcohol exposure was achieving significantly better results. Their recommendation was to investigate whether the British were under-reporting consumption or whether the data collection methodology was flawed. Pruitt knew the answer. The data was accurate. The methodology was sound. The British simply operated by different rules. A document that General Stanley McChrystal would later reference in his analysis of coalition special operations effectiveness noted that British SAS teams demonstrated what the report called exceptional stress inoculation, the ability to perform complex tasks under conditions that would degrade most operators. The report's authors attributed this to selection and training. They didn't mention alcohol, but Pruitt understood the connection that the analysts had missed. The British had built a system that trained men to perform when conditions weren't optimal, and then consistently placed those men in suboptimal conditions to prove the training worked. The beer wasn't, despite the professionalism. It was part of it. What happened in the final weeks of the deployment cemented this understanding in ways that statistics alone never could. In late November, intelligence indicated that a senior al-Qaeda facilitator, designated Objective Falcon, would be transiting through a village northwest of Ramadi. The window was impossibly tight. The target would be in location for approximately 4 hours during a single night. Weather conditions were severe. Sandstorm activity had grounded most coalition aviation assets. The American Quick Reaction Force was unavailable, committed to another operation that had gone kinetic 60 kilometers to the south. The British squadron commander was informed of the opportunity at 1900 hours. The team designated for the mission had been stood down that morning after completing a 36-hour reconnaissance operation. They had been drinking since 1400, not heavily by their standards, but enough that any American unit would have been automatically disqualified from deployment. Pruitt was present when the squadron commander made his decision. The conversation lasted less than 90 seconds. The commander asked one question: "Can you do it?" The response came from the team leader, a sergeant whose name appeared nowhere in official records. "We're good to go." No mention was made of the alcohol consumed over the previous 5 hours. No assessment was requested. No blood test was suggested. The commander simply nodded and said, "Wheels up in 40. The operation that followed should not have worked. The team inserted by vehicle because helicopter support was unavailable. They covered 19 kilometers on foot through a sandstorm that reduced visibility to less than 5 meters. They reached the target compound with 11 minutes to spare before the facilitators' projected arrival, established a hasty observation position, and watched as the target vehicle appeared exactly on schedule. What happened next took less than 4 minutes. The team breached the compound, secured 3 individuals, including the primary target, collected a laptop and 2 mobile phones that would later yield intelligence, leading to 14 additional operations, and exfiltrated without a single shot fired. The sandstorm that had nearly prevented the mission became their ally. No witnesses, no evidence, no trace that coalition forces had ever been present. The target was delivered to the detention facility at 03:47. The team was back at the compound by 05:30. By the time Pruitt saw them at breakfast 3 hours later, they were drinking again. Tea this time, with one sergeant consuming what appeared to be his 3rd Guinness of the morning. The facilitator's capture triggered a cascade of operations that dismantled a significant portion of al-Qaeda's logistics network in Anbar province over the following 6 weeks. McChrystal's command would later cite the intelligence haul as one of the most significant of the entire campaign. The after-action review noted that the mission had been executed under non-standard personnel readiness conditions. The closest the bureaucratic language would come to acknowledging that the operators had been drinking beer 5 hours before insertion. In the weeks that followed, Pruitt observed something shift in his own thinking. He stopped noticing the drinking. He stopped noting it in his communications back to Fort Bragg. When his replacement arrived in January for the standard handover briefing, Pruitt spent less than 30 seconds on the subject of British alcohol consumption. "They drink," he said. "Don't let it concern you. Watch what they do, not what they drink." It was the closest he ever came to an explicit endorsement. The final entry in Pruitt's liaison journal, dated January 14, 2007, contained no reflection on cultural differences, No analysis of operational methodologies, no recommendations for American forces to adopt British practices. It contained a single notation. Attended farewell gathering with B Squadron. Consumed 3 pints of Tennant's. Mission ready. He had never written those words before about himself. He never wrote them again. 3 years after his return from Iraq, Pruitt was assigned to the Joint Special Operations University at MacDill Air Force Base. His responsibilities included developing curriculum for the Interagency Collaboration Module, training designed to prepare American special operators for joint missions with Allied forces. The syllabus he created included a case study that never mentioned alcohol directly. It was titled Performance Optimization Under Non-Standard Readiness Conditions. The opening slide contained a single question. What if everything you believe about preparation is wrong? The module is still taught. British SAS instructors are occasionally invited to participate. When they do, the evening before the final exercise invariably includes a visit to the nearest establishment serving proper beer. American students who participate in these sessions report that their performance the following day is, against all expectation, measurably improved. Nobody has successfully explained why. In 2019, a researcher from the RAND Corporation conducting the study on Allied force integration interviewed Pruitt about his Iraq experience. The conversation lasted 2 hours and covered topics ranging from intelligence sharing protocols to equipment interoperability. Near the end, the researcher asked a question that wasn't on her list. What's the one thing about working with the British that most surprised you? Pruitt thought for a moment. Then he said something that appeared nowhere in his official reports, his journal, or his curriculum materials. I spent 6 months trying to figure out why they were better than us. Better intelligence, better planning, better execution. And they were doing it drunk. Or at least, what we would call drunk. He paused. Eventually I stopped asking why. I just started asking what they knew that we didn't. That was the wrong question, too. The researcher waited. The right question was simpler. They'd been fighting small wars for 400 years. We'd been fighting big wars for 80. Different problems require different tools. He looked out the window of his office toward a parade ground where young operators were practicing building clearance drills. We built a system that produces excellent soldiers. They built a system that produces men who happen to be soldiers. The difference is everything. The researcher noted his words, but did not include them in her final report. They were too imprecise for academic analysis. They resisted quantification. They smelled, she wrote in her personal notes, of something unscientific. They smelled of beer and victory. But that wasn't the end of the story. In January 2021, 14 years after his Iraq deployment, Pruitt received an unexpected package at his home in Tampa. The return address was a post office box in Hereford, England. Inside was a single item, a metal tankard, dented and scratched, with the SAS wing dagger emblem barely visible beneath years of accumulated patina. A note was attached, handwritten on plain paper. Thought you should have this. It belonged to the sergeant who led the Falcon Op. He passed last month. Liver was fine. It was his heart. He always said you were the only American who understood that the drinking wasn't the point. The point was everything else. B Squadron lads. Pruitt placed the tankard on his desk. He keeps it there still. Every visitor asks about it. He has never once explained its significance. The sergeant's name was never declassified. His service record remains sealed until 2047. The only public acknowledgement of his existence is a small brass plaque in the churchyard of St. Martin's in Hereford, bearing the inscription that appears on all SAS memorials, "Who dares wins." Below it, someone has scratched 4 additional words into the metal.